He laughed when she asked for respect, but before the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, the same man would be trembling in front of her conference table, begging for mercy in a voice barely louder than a whisper. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel and support our work, because stories about dignity, justice, and unexpected reversals deserve to be told, and your support gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful stories every single week. The 23rd floor of Holloway Freight Solutions smelled faintly of polished wood, burnt coffee, and expensive cologne as employees filled the glass-walled conference room for the Monday morning operations meeting. Outside, cold rain streaked across the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago, turning the city into a blur of gray steel and headlights. Inside, nobody spoke louder than necessary whenever Richard Holloway was in the room. At 52, Richard carried himself like a man who believed the world existed to obey him. His navy Italian suit fit perfectly against his broad shoulders, and the silver watch on his wrist gleamed every time he tapped impatient fingers against the mahogany table. Every movement radiated authority, wealth, and the quiet cruelty of someone who had learned that fear was often more effective than respect. At the far end of the room sat Evelyn Carter, nearly invisible among the department coordinators and junior staff. Her beige cardigan looked plain beside the designer jackets around her, and her old leather notebook rested neatly beside a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. At 39, Evelyn had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. She arrived early, stayed late, and rarely interrupted anyone. Most employees barely noticed her unless they needed spreadsheets corrected or shipping records fixed before a deadline. Some younger staff jokingly called her the ghost woman when she wasn't around. Evelyn never reacted. That morning, however, the tension in the room felt different. Richard paced slowly beside the presentation screen while a nervous warehouse supervisor named Martin Hale stood near the projector clutching a folder with trembling hands. 3 delayed shipments in 1 week, Richard said coldly. Do you understand how incompetent that makes this company look? Martin swallowed hard. Sir, the storms in Milwaukee shut down Interstate 94 for nearly 12 hours. We did everything possible to reroute. Excuses, Richard snapped. People like you always have excuses. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Martin's face turned red as several employees lowered their eyes toward the table. Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing sharply across the hardwood floor. You've worked here 9 years and still can't handle pressure. Incredible. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper coffee cup. Martin opened his mouth again, but Richard cut him off with a dismissive laugh that echoed through the room. Maybe retirement would suit you better than logistics. A few uncomfortable chuckles followed from nervous executives trying to stay on Richard's good side. Martin looked completely humiliated now, standing frozen beneath the bright conference lights. Then, for the first time all morning, Evelyn Carter spoke. Her voice was calm, soft, but impossibly clear in the silence. People deserve respect, even when things go wrong. The room instantly went still. Richard turned toward her slowly, almost amused. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Rain slid quietly down the giant windows behind him as Richard stared at the quiet woman at the end of the table like he had only just noticed she existed. Then he laughed, loudly, cruelly. Respect, he repeated, grinning at the executives around him. From someone like you? A few people laughed nervously with him. Others stared down at their laptops, pretending not to hear. Evelyn remained completely still. Her blue eyes never left Richard Holloway's face. And in that moment, none of them realized they were watching the beginning of his downfall. The silence lingered long after Richard Holloway's laughter faded from the conference room. Nobody defended Evelyn Carter. Nobody defended Martin either. One by one, employees lowered their eyes toward glowing laptop screens or pretended to study quarterly reports scattered across the table. The storm outside darkened the windows even further, turning the city skyline into a reflection of cold office lights and tense faces. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit with visible satisfaction before returning to the front of the room as though nothing important had happened. "Now," he said smoothly, "let us continue discussing why missed deadlines happen when weak people are allowed to stay comfortable." His words landed heavily across the room. Martin sat down slowly, shoulders slumped in humiliation, while the younger supervisors avoided eye contact with him entirely. Evelyn remained perfectly still at the far end of the table, her expression calm, unreadable, almost detached. But beneath the conference table, her fingers tightened quietly around the edge of her notebook. She had seen men like Richard Holloway before, men who mistook intimidation for leadership, men who believed silence meant weakness. The meeting dragged on for another 40 minutes beneath the constant tapping of rain against glass. Richard criticized shipment reports, mocked a scheduling coordinator for a minor accounting error, and publicly questioned whether the human resources director was asleep half the time. Every insult drew nervous laughter from executives desperate to remain in his favor. By the time the meeting finally ended, the room felt emotionally exhausted. Employees gathered their papers quickly and escaped into the hallway with visible relief. Martin left first, staring at the floor. Evelyn quietly packed her notebook into her worn leather bag while conversations whispered around her like distant static. "I cannot believe she talked back to him. She is finished after today." Richard never forgets embarrassment. The elevator lobby outside the conference room buzzed with nervous energy as workers hurried between departments carrying coffee cups and tablets. Holloway Freight Solutions occupied nearly 3 floors of the downtown tower, and every inch of it reflected Richard's obsession with control. Dark marble floors, glass offices, expensive minimalist artwork chosen more to impress clients than inspire employees. Evelyn walked slowly through the operations wing toward her small cubicle near the back of the building. Nobody stopped her, most barely acknowledged her existence. Her desk sat beside a narrow window overlooking the loading docks 30 stories below where semi-trucks lined up beneath cold rain and flashing amber lights. A faded ceramic mug rested beside neatly organized shipping manifests, stacked with almost surgical precision. Everything about Evelyn's workspace reflected order, discipline, invisibility. Around noon, the office atmosphere shifted again when Richard emerged from his private office with 2 senior executives following behind him. Conversations immediately quieted. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor as he stopped beside Evelyn's desk. Several nearby employees pretended to work while secretly listening. Richard placed a thick folder onto her keyboard. "Since you enjoy involving yourself in management decisions," he said coolly, "you can handle the Midwest compliance audit." Evelyn looked down at the stack. Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly. The audit files were enormous. Weeks of missing inventory reports, transportation disputes, delayed customs records, and unresolved vendor contracts. Impossible to finish by the end of the day. Richard knew that, which was exactly why he assigned it to her. "I need a complete report on my desk by 5 o'clock, he continued. "Failure is not an option." One of the executives standing behind him shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what this really was: not work, punishment. Richard leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice enough that only nearby employees could hear. "Perhaps this will remind you where your place is." Then he walked away. The office remained silent long after he disappeared behind the glass walls of the executive corridor. Evelyn stared quietly at the mountain of paperwork covering her desk while thunder rolled softly across the city outside. Her reflection in the darkened window looked calm. But somewhere deep beneath that calm, something old had just awakened. By 1:30 that afternoon, the rain over Chicago had become heavier, drumming steadily against the towering glass windows of Holloway Freight Solutions, while gray clouds swallowed most of the daylight outside. Inside the operations department, tension spread quietly from cubicle to cubicle like an invisible electrical current. Everyone knew Richard Holloway was targeting Evelyn Carter now. Nobody said it openly, but people watched her from the corners of their eyes whenever she passed through the office carrying stacks of audit files against her chest. The Midwest compliance audit covered nearly 18 months of transportation records, vendor disputes, warehouse inventory corrections, and customs documentation from 3 separate states. Even a full department would struggle to finish it in less than a week. Richard had given her 4 hours. At her desk near the loading dock windows, Evelyn worked in complete silence while overhead fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across rows of computer monitors. She removed her cardigan carefully and folded it over the back of her chair before opening the first file. Her movements were calm, precise, unhurried. Around her, phones rang constantly while printers hummed and employees whispered in low voices. He is setting her up. There is no way she survives this. Human resources cannot even protect her now. Evelyn ignored all of it. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet filled her monitor as she scanned shipping manifests with astonishing speed. Most people would have missed the irregularities buried inside thousands of pages of vendor transactions. Evelyn noticed them within minutes. Duplicate invoice numbers, missing customs declarations, fuel reimbursements processed through inactive accounts. Her blue eyes moved steadily across the screen while rainwater streaked downward outside like silver lines sliding across glass. At 2:15, a young accounting coordinator named Melissa approached her desk nervously holding a clipboard. "Evelyn," she whispered carefully, "you should probably stop for lunch at least." Evelyn looked up politely. "Thank you, Melissa, I am fine." Melissa hesitated before lowering her voice further. "Richard already told executives the audit problems are probably your fault." The words hung heavily between them. Evelyn did not react immediately. She simply leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Melissa with quiet calm. "Did he?" Melissa nodded uneasily. "He told finance that someone altered compliance reports last quarter. He wants the board to believe it happened in operations." Evelyn glanced back toward the towering glass offices lining the executive corridor. Through the transparent walls, Richard Holloway stood confidently beside 2 executives while laughing about something over expensive espresso drinks. Completely relaxed, completely certain of his control over the company, Melissa shifted uncomfortably. "I just thought you should know." Evelyn offered a faint smile. "I appreciate your honesty." After Melissa walked away, Evelyn slowly opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Hidden beneath ordinary office supplies sat an old silver flash drive attached to a faded leather keychain. For several seconds, she simply stared at it while distant thunder rolled across the skyline outside. 5 years ago, Evelyn Carter had promised herself she would never use those skills again. Never return to investigations. Never return to corporate corruption cases or federal hearings or the endless nights studying financial fraud until sunrise. After her husband died unexpectedly from a heart condition, she walked away from that world entirely. She chose anonymity instead. Simplicity, silence. Holloway Freight Solutions had been supposed to be temporary. Safe, but men like Richard Holloway always made the same mistake. They believed quiet people were powerless. At 3:05, Richard emerged from the executive corridor and strode confidently through the operations floor again. He stopped beside Evelyn's desk and glanced down at the stacks of files surrounding her. "Almost done?" he asked with mocking amusement. Several nearby employees froze, pretending not to listen. Evelyn looked up slowly from her monitor. "I am making progress." Richard smirked. "Good, because at 5 o'clock the board wants answers." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "And when this disaster lands on your shoulders, perhaps you will finally learn not to challenge me again." Then he walked away without noticing the expression in Evelyn's eyes. It was not fear anymore. It was recognition. The kind that appears when someone finally decides they have nothing left to lose. At 4 o'clock, Holloway Freight Solutions felt less like a corporate office and more like a building waiting for a storm to break apart its foundation. The rain outside had slowed into a cold mist drifting across downtown Chicago, and the fading afternoon light painted the glass towers in dull shades of silver and blue. Inside the operations department, employees moved carefully through the aisles between cubicles, speaking in lowered voices whenever Richard Holloway walked past. Rumors had spread through every floor by then. The board of directors had called an emergency review meeting for 5:30. Executives from finance and compliance were arriving early. Everyone understood what that meant. Someone was about to be blamed publicly for the company's growing audit problems, and Richard had already chosen his target. Evelyn Carter sat alone at her desk beneath the pale fluorescent lights while dozens of digital spreadsheets filled her computer monitor. Her expression remained calm, but the pace of her work had changed completely. Faster now. Sharper. Lines of numbers reflected across her eyes as she moved through years of shipping records with the quiet precision of someone reconnecting with an old instinct she had buried long ago. Around her, employees packed bags nervously and avoided unnecessary conversations. Nobody wanted to remain near the operations floor once the executives gathered upstairs. Nobody except Evelyn. At 4:12, her office phone rang softly. She answered without looking away from the screen. Operations? Evelyn? The voice belonged to Martin Hale. He sounded exhausted. I just wanted to say thank you for earlier. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair. Through the loading dock windows behind her, trucks rolled slowly through the rain while orange hazard lights blinked against wet concrete 30 stories below. You do not owe me thanks, she replied gently. Martin hesitated before speaking again. Most people here stay quiet because they are afraid of Richard. Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the executive corridor at the far end of the building, where Richard's enormous corner office overlooked the city like a throne above the company he controlled through fear. Fear only works, she said softly, when people believe the truth cannot protect them. Martin fell silent for a moment. You sound like you have dealt with people like him before. Evelyn's fingers rested quietly against the old silver flash drive beside her keyboard. I have. After the call ended, she inserted the flash drive into her computer for the first time in years. The screen flickered briefly before encrypted folders appeared across the monitor. Case archives, federal investigation templates, financial tracing programs, internal audit reconstruction systems, tools she once used almost daily before walking away from that world forever. The office around her suddenly felt very quiet. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for several seconds as old memories surfaced beneath the cold glow of fluorescent lights. Courtrooms, corporate hearings, men in expensive suits swearing innocence while hidden accounts collapsed under evidence they never expected anyone to find. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Then she began typing. At 4:38, Richard Holloway stood inside the executive lounge laughing with senior board members over whiskey poured into crystal glasses. Warm amber lighting reflected against polished marble countertops while soft jazz played through hidden speakers overhead. Richard looked completely relaxed, confident, victorious. The compliance issue will be handled tonight, he assured the board chairman smoothly. Operations made serious reporting mistakes, but we already identified the employee responsible. One executive frowned slightly. And you are certain there is nothing deeper here? Richard smiled without hesitation. Absolutely. Across the building, Evelyn stared at a set of financial transfers now glowing across her monitor. Offshore vendor payments routed through inactive shell corporations, duplicate transportation reimbursements tied directly to executive approval accounts, unauthorized cash movements hidden beneath warehouse expansion expenses. The deeper she looked, the uglier the pattern became. Richard Holloway had not simply manipulated reports. He had built an entire empire of fraud behind the company's success. Evelyn slowly removed her glasses and looked toward the darkening skyline outside. The sun was beginning to sink behind the city now, casting long orange reflections across the rain-covered windows. Somewhere upstairs, Richard Holloway still believed he controlled the ending of this story, and that was exactly what was about to destroy him. By 5:15, the upper executive floor of Holloway Freight Solutions glowed with warm golden light against the darkening Chicago skyline, while tension tightened through the building like invisible wire. Employees who normally stayed late had already begun slipping quietly toward elevators, eager to avoid whatever was about to happen inside the boardroom. The storm clouds outside had finally broken apart, revealing streaks of orange sunset stretching across the glass towers downtown. But inside Holloway Freight Solutions, the atmosphere had turned colder than ever. In the executive conference room, board members arranged thick financial binders neatly across the polished mahogany table, while assistants poured coffee into white ceramic cups. The walls of glass surrounding the room reflected the fading city lights like mirrors, making the entire space feel suspended above Chicago itself. Richard Holloway stood confidently near the head of the table, speaking with the board chairman, Charles Benton, a silver-haired investor known for protecting profits above all else. "This will be straightforward," Richard assured him calmly. "Operations failed compliance reporting procedures, and unfortunately one employee ignored protocol." Charles adjusted his glasses. "You are referring to Evelyn Carter?" Richard nodded smoothly. "A lower-level coordinator with access to inventory reporting systems. Human error created significant inconsistencies." He spoke with absolute confidence, never noticing how several executives exchanged uncertain glances behind him. Something about the situation felt too prepared, too convenient. At the far end of the floor, elevator doors opened quietly. Evelyn Carter stepped out carrying nothing except her old leather notebook and a slim silver laptop tucked beneath one arm. Her beige cardigan had been folded neatly over her shoulder now, revealing a crisp white blouse beneath it. She walked calmly down the silent executive hallway while city lights shimmered through towering windows beside her. The closer she moved toward the boardroom, the quieter the floor became. Two junior assistants paused mid-conversation when they saw her approach. A finance manager standing near the copier stiffened nervously before lowering his eyes. Somehow, the invisible woman from operations no longer seemed invisible at all. Inside the conference room, Richard glanced toward the glass doors as Evelyn entered. A faint smile crossed his face. Predatory, certain, perfect timing, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Please have a seat, Evelyn." Every eye in the room followed her as she calmly sat near the middle of the long table. The board members studied her carefully now, curious to see the quiet employee Richard had spent all afternoon blaming for the compliance crisis threatening the company. Charles Benton cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, serious reporting irregularities have been connected to operations management. Mr. Holloway informs us that your department handled many of these transactions directly." Richard folded his hands confidently. "Unfortunately, yes." Evelyn looked toward him quietly. Her expression revealed nothing. Richard continued smoothly, enjoying the performance. "We all understand mistakes happen, but accountability matters. Holloway Freight Solutions cannot survive if employees disregard ethical reporting standards." The hypocrisy in his voice settled heavily across the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another avoided eye contact entirely. Richard opened a presentation folder dramatically before sliding several printed audit pages across the table. "As you can see, these records contain manipulated vendor documentation and missing approvals connected directly to operations files under Ms. Carter's supervision." Charles frowned while scanning the paperwork. "This is extremely serious." Richard nodded solemnly, "which is why immediate termination may be necessary." Silence followed. Evelyn slowly placed her silver laptop onto the conference table. The soft click echoed sharply through the room. Richard barely noticed. He was too focused on delivering his final blow. "Before the board proceeds," Evelyn said quietly, "there is something everyone here deserves to see first." Richard leaned back with amused confidence. "Please," he said with a small smile. "Go ahead." Evelyn opened the laptop calmly and connected it to the massive presentation screen mounted against the wall. For one brief moment, the screen remained black. Then rows of financial transfers appeared across the display in bright white numbers against a dark background. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, hidden vendor chains, unauthorized executive reimbursements. The room went completely silent. Richard's smile disappeared instantly. The silence inside the executive conference room felt almost unreal as the glowing financial records covered the massive presentation screen wall to wall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The soft hum of the ceiling ventilation system suddenly sounded louder than the city traffic 40 floors below. Outside the glass walls, sunset painted the Chicago skyline in deep orange and fading gold, but inside Holloway Freight Solutions, every ounce of warmth had disappeared from the room. Richard Holloway stared at the screen as though he no longer recognized the world around him. The confidence that had carried him all afternoon drained visibly from his face, while lines of unauthorized transfers continued scrolling across the display. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, vendor payments routed through inactive transportation companies, executive bonuses disguised as warehouse maintenance expenses. The evidence was organized with terrifying precision. Charles Benton slowly removed his glasses and leaned forward over the polished conference table. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked quietly. Evelyn Carter remained seated calmly beside her open laptop, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "A financial reconstruction of executive transactions connected to hidden vendor accounts over the last 4 fiscal years," she replied. Her voice remained soft, controlled, professional. Richard finally forced a short laugh, though it sounded strained now. "This is absurd," he snapped quickly. "You expect us to believe a logistics coordinator suddenly became a forensic accountant overnight?" Evelyn turned toward him slowly. "No," she said calmly. "I expect them to believe evidence." The room went silent again. One board member shifted uneasily, while another stared at the screen with growing alarm. Richard stepped toward the presentation display, pointing aggressively at one of the transaction records. "These documents could have been manipulated." Evelyn nodded slightly. "That is true." Richard immediately looked relieved for half a second. Then she continued, "Which is why every file includes federal verification timestamps and direct routing confirmations from the banking institutions involved." Charles Benton looked up sharply. "Federal verification?" Evelyn reached calmly into her leather notebook and slid several printed documents across the table. 3 years ago, Holloway Freight Solutions underwent a limited compliance review involving transportation tax discrepancies. During that review, irregular patterns connected to executive approvals were quietly flagged. Richard's face lost more color. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn looked directly into his eyes now. "I was the investigator assigned to review those patterns." Nobody in the room moved. Even the assistant standing near the walls looked frozen beneath the warm conference lighting. Richard blinked slowly as though struggling to process what he had just heard. "You," he whispered. Evelyn gave a small nod. "Before I came here, I worked in corporate financial investigations for 12 years. Charles Benton stared at her in disbelief. "You never disclosed that during hiring." "I did not apply for an investigative position," Evelyn replied calmly. "I applied for a quiet life." Her words settled heavily across the room. Richard suddenly straightened his posture, trying desperately to regain control. "This is retaliation," he snapped. "She is angry because she failed her responsibilities, and now she is manufacturing accusations." But his voice no longer carried authority. It carried panic. Evelyn pressed one key on her laptop. The screen changed instantly. A new file appeared: audio transcripts, executive approvals, internal emails. Richard's own digital signature repeated across dozens of hidden authorizations. One executive covered his mouth quietly. Another leaned back in complete disbelief. Richard's breathing became visibly uneven now. "No," he muttered under his breath. "That is not possible." Evelyn's eyes never left him. "You spent years believing nobody would ever look closely enough." The fading sunlight reflected across the glass walls behind her, casting long golden shadows across the conference room table. Richard Holloway looked around desperately now, searching for support from the same executives who had laughed beside him only hours earlier. But nobody spoke. Nobody defended him. The room that once feared him had become a courtroom of silence. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Holloway finally understood what powerlessness felt like. The executive conference room remained frozen beneath the fading orange glow of sunset, while Richard Holloway stood motionless near the presentation screen, like a man watching his entire future collapse in real time. Outside the towering glass walls, downtown Chicago slowly transformed into a sea of headlights and illuminated skyscrapers. But inside Holloway Freight Solutions, nobody seemed capable of looking away from the evidence glowing across the screen. The room no longer belonged to Richard. It belonged to Evelyn Carter. Charles Benton slowly rose from his chair, his expression darker now than anyone in the company had ever seen. "Richard," he said carefully, "tell me there is an explanation for this." Richard swallowed hard before forcing himself to straighten his tie. "Of course there is," he replied quickly. "These transactions are being taken completely out of context." His voice tried to sound confident, but the strain underneath it was impossible to hide now. Evelyn remained seated quietly while another series of files appeared across the presentation screen. Wire transfers connected to hidden transportation subsidiaries. Internal messages authorizing falsified maintenance expenses. Corporate reimbursements routed through accounts registered under fake consulting firms. Every document pointed toward one person. Richard stepped forward aggressively. "This proves nothing." Evelyn finally stood. Slowly, calmly. The movement alone shifted the atmosphere inside the room. For years, she had trained herself to disappear into the background, to move quietly through life without drawing attention. But now every executive in the room watched her with complete focus. "You are correct," she said softly. "By themselves, financial records prove very little." Richard immediately nodded toward the board members. "Exactly." Then Evelyn pressed another key. The screen changed again. A video conference recording appeared dated 14 months earlier. Richard's own voice filled the silent room. "Move the vendor payments through the Illinois account first," the recording said clearly. "Nobody checks warehouse maintenance routing." Richard froze. Absolute silence swallowed the conference room. One board member slowly lowered his coffee cup onto the table with trembling hands. Another executive stared openly at Richard now with visible disgust. The recording continued. "If compliance asks questions, operations will absorb the blame. Those people never push back anyway." Richard lunged toward the laptop instinctively. "Turn that off." His composure shattered completely for the first time all day. Evelyn did not move. "You spent years hiding behind authority," she said quietly. "You assumed nobody below you mattered enough to notice what you were doing." Richard's face had become pale beneath the warm conference lights. "Evelyn," he said suddenly, his tone changing completely. Softer now, desperate. "We can discuss this privately." The shift stunned everyone in the room. Just hours earlier, he had mocked her publicly in front of the entire company. Now the same man sounded almost frightened. Charles Benton looked between them carefully. "You know each other beyond this company?" Evelyn's eyes remained locked on Richard. 3 years ago, I was part of a federal investigation involving transportation fraud tied to Midwest shipping corporations. Charles frowned. "And Richard knew that?" Richard answered before she could. "Not officially." His breathing had grown uneven. "I recognized her name after she joined operations, but she kept quiet, so I assumed she walked away from that career." Evelyn gave the faintest nod. "I did." Richard looked at her now with genuine panic settling into his expression. "Then why are you doing this?" The question hung heavily beneath the dim conference lighting while city reflections shimmered across the glass walls around them. Evelyn's voice remained calm when she answered. Because this morning, you humiliated good people simply because you believed they were powerless. Nobody spoke after that. The room felt smaller somehow. Colder. Richard looked around desperately at the board members who once feared him, but their faces had changed completely now. Some looked angry, others looked betrayed. A few simply looked ashamed for staying silent so long. Then Charles Benton spoke quietly. Corporate legal counsel and federal compliance authorities need to be contacted immediately. Richard's eyes widened. Charles, wait. But Charles did not look at him anymore. For the first time in years, Richard Holloway was no longer the most powerful person in the room, and everyone could feel it. The last light of sunset stretched across the Chicago skyline like burning gold reflected against endless walls of glass, while the executive conference room of Holloway Freight Solutions descended into complete chaos beneath the surface of forced professionalism. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The silence itself had become unbearable. Richard Holloway stood near the presentation screen with one trembling hand resting against the edge of the conference table as board members whispered urgently among themselves. The authority he once carried so effortlessly had evaporated almost completely. Now he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a man trapped inside a nightmare he could no longer control. Charles Benton stepped away from the table and quietly instructed an assistant to contact corporate legal counsel immediately. Another board member began reviewing printed transaction records with visible disbelief, while two compliance officers standing near the door exchanged grim expressions. Every few seconds, someone glanced toward Evelyn Carter, not with pity anymore, with respect. Quiet, uneasy respect. Evelyn remained standing beside her laptop beneath the warm conference lights, calm as ever. The glow of the presentation screen reflected softly across her face, while rows of financial evidence remained frozen behind her like the final page of a story Richard could no longer rewrite. Richard finally took a slow step toward her. "Evelyn," he said carefully, lowering his voice. "Please." The words sounded unnatural coming from him. Weak. Fragile. Nobody in that room had likely ever heard Richard Holloway ask anyone for anything politely. Evelyn looked at him without expression. Richard swallowed hard. "We do not need to destroy each other over this." Charles Benton glanced sharply toward him. Destroy each other? Richard ignored him completely. His eyes stayed locked on Evelyn now with growing desperation. "You made your point," he continued quietly. "You exposed the transactions. Fine, but federal investigators do not need to become involved." Evelyn said nothing. Outside the glass walls, helicopters blinked silently across the darkening skyline while streams of headlights crawled through evening traffic far below. Richard stepped closer. "I can fix this," he whispered. "Bonuses, promotions, whatever you want." One board member actually looked sick hearing the words. The room fell still again. Evelyn slowly closed her laptop. The soft click echoed through the conference room with startling finality. Then, she looked directly at Richard Holloway for what felt like the first honest moment between them all day. "This morning," she said softly, "a man who worked for this company for 9 years stood humiliated in front of his coworkers while you laughed at him." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Evelyn continued calmly. "You treated people like they were disposable because you believed power gave you permission." Richard's breathing had become shallow now. "Evelyn, please." There it was again, that word, please. The same man who mocked her for asking for respect only hours earlier was now standing beneath the fading sunset, asking quietly for mercy in front of the entire board. Nobody missed the irony. Nobody dared interrupt it. Evelyn's eyes remained steady. "You spent years believing fear made you untouchable." Richard shook his head weakly. "I was wrong." The confession barely sounded audible. Charles Benton stared at him in disbelief. Several executives lowered their eyes awkwardly, suddenly ashamed of every moment they stayed silent while Richard humiliated employees beneath this same roof. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the giant windows overlooking Chicago. The sun had almost disappeared completely now, leaving only deep orange reflections shimmering across the glass. Then she looked back at Richard. "Respect was all I asked for." The words landed harder than any accusation. Richard looked like he had been drained of all strength. For several long seconds, nobody moved inside the conference room. Then elevator doors opened somewhere beyond the executive hallway. Footsteps approached calmly across polished marble floors. Corporate attorneys had arrived. Richard turned slowly toward the sound, and for the first time all day, genuine fear settled fully across his face. The room watched silently as the empire he built through intimidation finally began collapsing around him. By 7:30 that evening, the lights inside Holloway Freight Solutions still burned across the upper executive floors, while most of downtown Chicago had already disappeared into the cold blue glow of night. Rainwater shimmered across the streets nearly 40 stories below as streams of headlights moved through the city like silent rivers of light. But inside the company Richard Holloway once controlled through intimidation and fear, everything had changed. The executive conference room no longer sounded like a place of power. It sounded like consequences. Corporate attorneys filled half the seats around the mahogany table now, while compliance officers reviewed financial records with quiet intensity. Stacks of documents covered every surface. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Even the air itself felt heavier. Richard Holloway sat near the end of the table, completely drained of the confidence that once defined him. His expensive navy suit looked wrinkled now beneath the harsh conference lighting, and the silver watch he once displayed so proudly rested useless against trembling fingers clasped tightly together. Across from him, Charles Benton reviewed legal statements in grim silence, while board members whispered about emergency shareholder meetings and federal exposure. Every few minutes, another damaging document appeared on the screen. Every few minutes, Richard seemed to shrink further into himself. Evelyn Carter stood quietly near the windows overlooking the city, her beige cardigan folded neatly over one arm, while distant thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the skyline. She looked nothing like the most powerful person in the room. And yet everyone present understood that without her, none of them would have ever known the truth. One of the attorneys finally closed his folder heavily. "Based on the evidence presented," he said carefully, "Mr. Holloway will be immediately suspended pending full federal investigation." The words settled across the room with absolute finality. Richard lowered his head slowly. No argument came this time. No arrogance. No threats, just silence. Charles Benton removed his glasses and looked toward him with visible disappointment. "You built this company into something respected," he said quietly, "and then you destroyed it yourself." Richard stared blankly at the polished table beneath the conference lights. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then his eyes slowly lifted toward Evelyn. There was something almost hollow in his expression now. Regret. Exhaustion. Humiliation. "I never thought any of this would matter," he admitted quietly. Evelyn looked at him calmly. That was always the problem. The room fell silent once more. Richard swallowed hard before speaking again. "I spent years believing strength meant making people fear me." Evelyn's voice remained soft when she answered. "Fear is not respect." Somewhere beyond the conference room walls, elevator doors opened and closed while employees whispered quietly through the executive hallways about what had happened upstairs. News traveled fast in corporate buildings, especially when powerful men fell. Earlier that morning, many of those same employees had avoided eye contact with Evelyn Carter as though she barely existed. Now several stood beyond the glass walls watching her with quiet admiration. Martin Hale stood among them too, his expression emotional but steady. Nobody would humiliate him publicly again, not after tonight. One attorney approached Richard carefully and requested his company access badge. Richard hesitated before slowly removing it from his jacket pocket. The small plastic card rested in his palm for a moment beneath the conference lights before he handed it over silently. The gesture felt strangely symbolic, like watching a kingdom disappear 1 inch at a time. Evelyn turned toward the windows overlooking Chicago one final time. The storm had finally passed. The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness beyond the glass, while reflections shimmered softly across the room behind her. She had not destroyed Richard Holloway. He had done that himself the moment he forgot that dignity belongs to everyone, not only the powerful. As Evelyn quietly walked toward the elevator lobby, conversations stopped around her. Employees moved aside respectfully. Nobody mocked her simple clothes now. Nobody looked through her like she was invisible. And in the silence that followed her departure, an entire company finally remembered what respect was supposed to look like.